Now, I have to say, the Young ME Sufferers Trust, that's who we are, we use the term ITIS. We have no intention of changing. I will say, to start with, just a few words about the Trust, because it started with children in 1989. It was the initiative of two teenagers with ME, and really they just wanted to make contact with other teenagers and invented a magazine which they called Times, T-Y-M-E-S, for the young ME sufferer. And of course, by the year 2000, a lot had happened, and it became a registered charity, and I took it over. I will say we have no paid staff. We are a small group of volunteers. It includes me. I'm not paid either. And we have actually just managed to co-fund the first biomedical research study in children with Merge and Spence, and also another charity, Search ME. And it was very hard raised money. £14,000 is not a lot for research, but it is for us, especially when we are always desperate to find the money to produce the next magazine, but that's where it's gone. The website has got free publications for families, doctors, teachers. We've got an advice line, a professionals referral service so that a doctor or a teacher can talk to someone in their own profession who has experience of ME, and we publish our magazine Vision, which is a voice for the children and the young people. We've got children from the age of 3 right to young people. Over 26, they stay with us, they pay for the magazine. Over 30, there's a big range of ages. So, just a little bit about the Trust, that's all for the moment. But I'm not just Executive Director of the Trust, that's not just why I'm here. I'm actually here because I'm a former, very severe ME sufferer myself. And when the question and answer session comes up this afternoon, you're welcome to ask me about any aspects of the illness from an insider's point of view. I should be quite happy with that. That's just an overview of what I'm going to talk to you about now. I will start with my personal perspective. I think it's important, and you'll see why when we go on. The scale of the problem in children is what I'm here to talk about as well, and the pattern of the illness in schools. It can tell us a lot. There are clustering of cases in schools. There are misdiagnoses in children. There is a problem, a dichotomy, an argument, a clash between education and medicine. And children have to be educated by law. I know that it's very difficult to get time off when you're an adult, but at least you can officially do it. Children have to be educated, sick or well. And this is what's led to a lot of the problems. Then we'll look at practical solutions. There are practical solutions. We'll talk about interactive online learning, which has made a great difference to a lot of children, and then we'll let the children speak for themselves. And I will say that I'm going to use the term ME throughout this lecture. So there's my personal perspective. The thing is, I knew nothing about ME. I was just head teacher of a school and had nothing to do with medicine except a connection which I will tell you later on. In 1985, I contracted ME, but I didn't know it was ME, of course, until it was diagnosed. I actually had a Coxsackie B virus, and that is one of the enteroviruses that Professor Hooper's been talking about. And I was so ill, I thought I was dying. Many of you will have experienced this. And the problem is that when people eventually recover a lot, and they may have a lot of residual difficulties and problems and disabilities, this isn't always recognised by other people who only see them when they're well, and we'll come to that with children later on. But as I began to recover, and I do mean as I began to recover, because we're talking about the fact that I was bedridden for years, we're talking about pain throughout the whole of my body, losing my vocabulary, a lot of my vocabulary, being almost unable to even chew food, having to take a break and a rest in between mouthfuls, and being unable even to comb my own hair unless I just rested my arm on something and couldn't grip the comb, had to droop my head down like this just to get the comb through my hair. And as I began to recover, sitting on a stool in order to use a bit of sliced bread because I couldn't slice bread, and being unable to open the can of soup that went in it, went with it because I couldn't. You've been there, some of you, I'm sure. So we are talking a very, very serious illness here and a terrible shock to me. And I began to study it because I got involved through the consultant who diagnosed me, which was Dr. Dowsett. And she asked me to help with children, which is how I got into this in the first place. Now, I wrote a book called Emmy the New Plague. And it's a funny thing, because when I look back to the first day that I was ill, I remember the day because Ian Gow, who was then the housing minister, was due to come and have lunch with me that day at the school. And the pains across my back were absolutely unbelievable. And I thought it was going to be the flu. Well, as it happens, many cases, if not all cases, of polio began with something like flu, with pain, with flu-like symptoms. They went away, but within a few weeks, along came the serious after effects, the complications in those patients who couldn't mount a satisfactory immune response for whatever reason. And I looked into, when I wrote Emmy the New Plague, that book documented links between Emmy and polio because it's a very polio-like illness, and my breathing was affected. I was unable to use my muscles properly, and we know that with children they can suffer paralysis for part of the time. Very familiar to anybody who knows about polio. Well, Emmy the New Plague is actually in the libraries of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And in fact, when one of the noble lords actually quoted it, he was taken aside later and told it was a lot of rubbish. We know better now, of course. The same year that Emmy the New Plague was published, another book was published, not by me, called A Summer Plague. That was about polio. And I'd got no idea when I chose the title for my book that this book was coming out. It's just a strange kind of symmetry there, isn't there? Well, when the study in 1997 came out that Dr. Dowsett and I did together, it took us 5 years to do that study. I was ill, and it was a huge undertaking. I'll show you why shortly. There was a furore in the national and in the medical press. I've still got, much the worse for wear, the front page of The Guardian from that time. And they chose the headline, which is an echo of my book the year before, Schools Swept by Emmy Plague. And you can see why there would be a furore in the medical press. There's Tony Blair beside it. And when that happened, people tried to criticise the study, to say, well, it can't possibly be the case. Again, of course, we know better now, because so many people have come up with the same findings that we've come. They've never done anything so big as what we did, but they're coming up with similar findings, and I'll show you those shortly. And when I was on the Adam Bolton show, we even had, because there was a big press furore too, we even had doctors ringing in. I think one was from Northern Ireland, just saying, well, people were lazy and all this kind of thing. So in 1999, I got involved with the BBC, with the Panorama Survey, and I actually designed that Panorama Survey with Matthew Hill of the BBC, and we'll look at that shortly. Then I became involved in the Chief Medical Officer's Working Group and helped to write Chapter 5, and the key points of that are on the Trust's website. I took over the Executive Director of Times Trust just after having written Zoe's Win, which was for young people, and then the Trust published Young Hearts, and that is another voice for young people. Children must be allowed to speak for themselves. They must be believed. And when they go to doctors with symptoms, or when the doctors come to them because they're too ill, they must be believed about their symptoms. And some of the things that are happening to children make me see red. It was Terry Waite who actually launched Young Hearts and wrote the foreword, and he talked about what he went through and the similarities in suffering between what he went through as a hostage and what these children are going through. Now, I was criticised, of course, for calling it Emmy the New Plague in the first place, but here's a dictionary definition of plague: a pestilence, affliction, or calamity on a large scale. Here's a quote from the book. Even though children of school age seem to represent only around 10% of cases, I'm not sure that's the case anymore, this still adds up to a likely 25,000 cases in this country. We know this because the total number of people with ME is now estimated at over 250,000. Now, I wrote that in 1996, and that is the source of the often quoted figure of 25,000 that you read all over the place, because nobody knows the scale of the problem. That was my best guesstimate based on other work, and there are other things behind it apart from that. So why does nobody know the scale of the problem? Because nobody's looking at the children in the schools the way Dr. Dowsett and I did. We need to know far more. Now, the book traced the link between ME and polio. It is a parallel. I used historical accounts of polio epidemics and the viruses involved. Polio is 3 viruses, polio 1 to 3, but the enterovirus family that it belongs in comprises Coxsackie viruses, echoviruses, and others. And in the old accounts, I believe there was one from Hawaii where there was an epidemic there, you will find references to polio, whether paralytic or non-paralytic, being caused by the other enteroviruses. So we have to look at this again. Now, ME has taken over really as vaccination against polio has come in. If you take a competitor out of the race, the others are going to have a field day. And I've also coined the phrase post-ME because I believe, and certainly my experience would tell me, if you talk to patients who have got ME, you can often look back and see that they were ill in their teens with a polio-like illness. And just as we get people with post-polio, I am certain we get people with post-ME. So the enteroviral theory was rubbish, but of course now it's taken seriously as possibly the cause. Abnormalities caused by the interaction between the virus and the individual host are another matter, because that determines how you respond to what assaults you. So why have we put a silent epidemic on this slide? Here's a quote from a microbiologist. Children are ignored and forgotten, yet they are at the epicenter, which keeps ME going and increasing in frequency. There was definitely another epidemic in 1995, which passed off unnoticed, as usual. Other epidemics are taken notice of. I know that you've heard about bird flu was mentioned earlier, wasn't it? Dr. Ian Gibson mentioned it. Well, the lead story in the Times said, bird flu, it's kids' stuff. They knew that things would be spread in schools. When Sky News was talking about bird flu, they said 50,000 lives would be saved if schools were closed. We want ME to be notifiable in schools to reveal the pattern. Now that is because we think it's a way around the fact that nobody's funding a big epidemiological study in children. Okay, we know you can argue about how it was diagnosed. It's another matter, but it should be notifiable in schools so you can see the pattern, and in staff as well as in children. Because history's the bugbear of ME, isn't it? I know that Byron is going to refer later to this, but we had 2 psychiatrists, McEvedy and Beard, who looked at the Royal Free epidemic in 292 members of staff at the Royal Free Hospital, and they said it was down to mass hysteria. Now, they were writing in 1970, and they hadn't seen the patients. One of them went on to talk about winter vomiting disease, as being caused by mass hysteria as well, and we all know where that led. We discovered the Norwalk virus. So the problem is that started this whole thing about, is ME psychological? And children are still paying the price. That history can also be a mine of information, and we should also be looking back at the epidemic records of ME and polio in the last century, as well as looking forward by doing biomedical research. The two should go hand in hand. We mustn't forget the past. That's the study we did in 1997. I know a lot of you know about this. I won't spend too long on it. But the fact is, we came up with 51% of long-term sickness absence in a sample of 333,024 pupils in 6 local educational authorities. And it is the biggest study that's ever been attempted, which is why it took 5 years. The nearest statistic was cancer and leukemia together with 23%. In other words, although the children had life-threatening illnesses, once they'd had treatment, they were able to get back into school. We found a prevalence of 70 per 100,000 in pupils and 500 per 100,000 in staff. And in fact, we studied 27,327 school roll of staff. So that was a big figure as well, although it's not on the slide. 40% were in single cases, 21% were in pairs, but 39% were in clusters of 3 or more. And we defined a cluster as 3 because there wasn't an existing definition of a cluster of ME. And we thought it was probably the best number to choose that would start to show up statistical significance. But of course, we know a lot of the clusters were much bigger than that. So what we showed, really, and smaller studies have confirmed it since, is that disabling and chronic this illness is. Psychological, it is not, and that's other reasons for that. We can go into that later, but it was showing an infectious pattern. It was showing a clustering pattern. And so if you just look at the effect of the clusters, this is what you see. This is just clusters of 3, but there were bigger clusters, and we knew of some schools where there were clusters of up to 11 from memory, I think. Certainly we knew of some where they didn't report them to us, and we couldn't use the statistics in the study. So there you see, for instance, the prevalence per 100,000 there is 70, so that was a cluster of children. 3 children out of 421. We expected a prevalence of 70 per 100,000. We actually saw a prevalence of 710 per 100,000, so it increased the prevalence by a factor of 10. In the next cluster of children, it increased the prevalence by a factor of 5.6. And in that last row, that is a cluster of staff, because you can see 500 per 100,000 is what we expected to find as the prevalence in staff. But that in the cluster was magnified by a factor of 11. We've got to look at clusters. That was the pattern in pupils. And the sort of dark red colour is the girls and the other is boys. You can see where the peak age was, sort of somewhere between 14 and 18. It only tails off at the end because obviously you don't get data from schools beyond that age. And it was 2-to-1 female to male. In the staff, it was 4-to-1 female to male, but then, of course, there are a lot more female staff anyway. So here is what I mentioned earlier. Here is what the Panorama Survey came up with. All these children are off sick. What is happening to them? There is this peculiar kind of interaction between the education and the medical profession. The Panorama Survey, and I will say that there were 741 families surveyed and a 62% response, so it's fairly representative. 59% of families were told by their doctors that the child's illness was psychological. 15% were told that it was their own psychological problems that were the cause. 7% of children were subjected to child protection proceedings. 5% had undergone psychological treatment. All the parents reported no effect or a negative effect. And look at this one, 4%, now that's 4 out of every 100 cases were labelled with that dreadful Munchausen syndrome by proxy label. Now, I designed that survey with Matthew Hill, and whatever one might say about the fault of the actual programme that came out after it and the editing and all of that, the survey stands on its own. We have to look at education because it's a specialist area. Misunderstandings are arising purely because the child isn't in school. But education is a key cause of relapse in children, and consultant paediatricians will tell you that. It's not just something I will say as a former head teacher. So here are some of the misunderstandings. School phobia. Well, if a child is school phobic and you let them go home, they're not ill anymore. You would think it was fairly simple to sort out the difference. But very often children get labelled as school phobic. Anorexia nervosa is another one. Child abuse or neglect is another one. Now, obviously, people have to look at these things. Of course, doctors have to look at them. But the point is there are these huge misunderstandings because of this way in which the illness has been seen as psychological. The child abuse neglect thing, obviously, if either the child isn't physically ill or someone is making them ill, or they are physically ill, but the parents aren't looking after them properly. It can't just be that this is a chronic disabling illness which it's impossible for anyone to cure at the moment. And we are having big problems even now with this, as I'll show you. Munchausen syndrome by proxy I've mentioned, and pervasive refusal syndrome is another one, where the child is thought to have turned off from the world because of some terrible trauma. Well, actually, they probably can't move, can't eat, can't think, can't speak. You've been there, or you know someone who has, or you've seen someone who has, perhaps on a television programme, because there have been some things recently which Invest in ME have tried to show about the severe cases that have never really been shown before satisfactorily in the media, and I congratulate them for that. But the point is, it wasn't just Panorama that found all these things out. 90% of inquiries we get to the Trust Advice line, when we did a study once, concerned things to do with schools. And we published a study called The Forgotten Children in 2003. We talked to 126 young people and parents. 87% had had to struggle for recognition of their needs. Now, if that's not the scale of the problem in schools, I don't know what is. 81% had actually had to move school to get recognition of their needs. Now, you don't move school just like that when you're not well. Something makes you do it. 63% had left state education altogether, and that's an indictment of my profession. 62% had felt threatened or bullied by other children's attitudes, and a massive 84% had felt threatened or bullied by the attitudes of professionals. So altogether, 72% didn't give a vote of confidence to state education for children with ME. Later, we got a grant just to look at what was happening in Essex, what the children and young people would like from one of these new clinics that Malcolm talked about. And we only talked to 48 parents and young people because we wanted to find out what they needed, and we were only talking about Essex, our home county. We found that 63% hadn't found the medical profession helpful. 79% said doctors or other professions had suggested their illness was psychological. That is higher than the Panorama Survey. And 25%, a quarter, said doctors or other professionals had suggested their illness was caused by their parents. Now, what are we to think? Is it worse in Essex? Has it got worse since 1999? Why? Okay, fairly small numbers. Maybe it was just unrepresentative. But what it points out is this phenomenon is not going away. Really, what is also happening is that the chronic nature of the illness is actually changing the diagnosis. What's happening is, even if you get a right diagnosis, they can't believe the child is ill for so long. And so it must, after all, be something psychological or have turned into something psychological. And you will get people who've had a diagnosis years ago, and now the medical profession renege on that diagnosis. And we get these problems coming up. Well, now look here, health versus education. This is the problem. Now, forgive me, the doctors and teachers here, This is just a very rough kind of summary of your roles. The purpose of education is to educate. Now, you'd think that was obvious. Any teacher will assume that their prime task is to enable pupils to learn and to achieve something worthwhile. Health professionals see their prime task as helping patients to recover from curable illnesses or to manage chronic incurable illnesses. And as Bruce Carruthers so eloquently said, how can you prevent your symptoms? That's part of it, isn't it? It's self-treatment. That is part of that. Now, this is where I'll mention my medical credentials. Yes, I'm not qualified as a medic, but I was married to a GP for 21 years, and as part of that, before the age of deputising services, of course, every time my husband was on duty, I took all the emergency calls for him. And I learned a lot through that because obviously I had to have a certain amount of advice how to do that and so on. So I know what it's like from the doctor's point of view, as well as from the medic's point of view. And I know that doctors want children to be, quotes, normal and get back to school and so on. But they're not. They cannot help the fact that they have got a serious illness. And school is not a social club. It's a pressurised hothouse full of corridors, stairs, noise, light, and schools are there to deliver results, academic results. In 2002, the Chief Medical Officer's Working Group concluded that education in the home was needed for most children with ME, and it could be for a prolonged period. Access to education for children and young people with medical needs, which is a government publication from the Department for Education and Skills. That said, in 2002, and it's statutory guidance, it must be obeyed, that education in the home must be provided for those too unwell for a school or a unit. And doctors have to get involved in prescribing it, because the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health have actually written in that a doctor's recommendation is supposed to be made for this kind of education. And so doctors can't avoid getting involved in a profession they're not trained for, and it's not their fault. Education and social contact can be provided for separately. It is possible. You can have a visit to school. Somebody can visit you at home. Nothing to do with your work. We all know, and Byron's going to tell us about the way in which the brain won't work properly. And if you exhaust a child trying to get them into school when they're not well enough, you won't get much in the way of academic results out of them. And here's the dilemma. Obviously, some children would like to get back and see their friends. Others think the most important thing is to get academic results, to get something to show for all their years of education. And you may have to do it differently for the individual person, but I will tell you how it is possible to get academic results as well as having ME. There is too much short-termism going on. In the old days, if you were sick as a child, first you got nothing, then you got a bit of home tuition, then you went back to school, full stop. It got a bit more complicated with the setup of hospital schools. But there's a separate system for children with special educational needs, and those children are recognised as having long-term needs. So they're assessed. Their needs are recorded. They get provision, and it's reviewed, and maybe a statement of special educational needs which gives them protection to the age of 19. And the problem with children is they fall into both categories. Both categories. But to get help, we all know you must have a diagnosis. And the Chief Medical Officer's Working Group and also the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health said that prompt diagnosis is a key to this. We'll have a quick look at this, and it's not a lecture for teachers, so we won't go into this in too much detail. But some of you will know about these principles that I worked out. And they work. Health before work. The point about this is that activity beyond the level that an individual can usually tolerate will prompt a delayed worsening of symptoms, and that comes from the CMO's working group. In other words, you will make them worse if you make them do too much. So you have to put health first, or they can't learn anyway. And there's got to be a balance between the claims of health and the claims of education. Here's a quote from a book I've been writing myself. It is a bit complicated, but If you think about it, it makes sense. A child who is recovering is a child who can achieve educationally. Conversely, if a child becomes worse, education suffers. If educational methods make the child worse, then education has itself caused educational disadvantage. Mental or physical energy in this illness are interchangeable. If you use too much physical energy, you can't think straight. If you spend too long on the computer, you feel worse. Energy-efficient education is what we have to do, and that's how we set it up. The focused curriculum, that means focusing on the subjects the child likes most and is best at. Never mind the national curriculum. That can be disapplied. So then, having cut down the subjects to 1, 2, or 3, depending on health, something the child's good at, something the child is interested in, you let them study that, and you let them take an exam in it. End on exams. That means they don't all take it at the same time when they're 16, try and get, qualifications in everything all at the same time. No, it's not rocket science. Think about someone learning the piano or the violin. What do? Well, they take an exam when they're ready. Now, this can work, and it does work in practice. And what happens then is that if you look at the bottom point on the screen, they get a portfolio, and they develop a portfolio. They can do this work in the home, they can do this work at school or in a unit or wherever they are well enough to do it, but they can do it if it's organised properly. That's what I mean by the goal-oriented environment. If the goal is to get qualifications, you don't just send them to school because that's where they're, in quotes, supposed to be. That's quite wrong. No, the 1944 Education Act said they must be given suitable education. That is still the law. And education is there to give them results. And therefore, if putting them into school is pulling down their results, what do? You can see there is an absolute hornet's nest out there. We also need to de-stress children and not distress them by telling them all kinds of porkies about it'll be all right next week, dear, and you will be able to take your exams, don't worry about that. No, you set up things early. You make adequate adaptations, and you protect their health at the same time. These two things are completely interchangeable. Now this preaching, if you like, has set me in direct conflict with a number of psychiatrists, and it's still going on. Here's something from the latest issue of Vision, which incidentally was uploaded to the internet today for Emmy Awareness Day. Here we go. A recent study, a follow-up study of CFS in children and adolescents, symptom persistence and school absenteeism, nice, published in Clinical Child Psychology and Psychiatry, concludes, maintaining school attendance is also vital if long-term morbidity is to be reduced. In other words, the children will remain ill if they don't go to school. My experience, and I'm sure a lot of yours, disproves it. So look at the principles of education and think of what I just showed you. What is education? Imparting knowledge and skills, training in becoming a self-learner, and development of your identity and your potential as a member of society. Nobody's useless, ill or not. Everybody's valuable. But nowhere in that definition does it say where that has to take place. We must target success. We must set children up to succeed. Frank Smith, the reading guru, had a eureka moment once. He said he suddenly realised that the brain is always learning. And if the brain learns, I can't do it, I'm ill when I do it, or when I try to do it, the brain switches off, and then you can't learn at all. You must set the children up to succeed. Put them in an environment where they can succeed. You reinforce it. The Australian research, showed that children who studied through the School of the Air got better results than those who went to school. And it's a complete myth that children who are educated at home are isolated because they're educated at home. Fit children who are educated at home, in education otherwise, meet each other, go out, have fun. They go to museums everywhere. It's because they are ill that these children are isolated, not because they're having to be at home to work. So if the principles we've been using don't work, you devise new principles. It was Dr. Alan Franklin who said, if the child doesn't fit the theory, then the theory is wrong. So coming to the end, partnership with NISI Education, that's a firm of, it's a private firm, supplies online education. We made a partnership with them. We have Interact online courses for under 16s, funded by the local education authorities. Over 16s are funded by the Learning and Skills Council. We've just been granted up to 2,000 places for that because the first tranche have been so successful. I think, in memory, 97% of the children who went in came out with, qualifications, GCSEs passed. They didn't all have ME, but the statistic for ME children is also good. And now I can announce, for the first time, you heard it here today, folks, we are going to do interactive online teacher training starting in September this year. September the 5th is the first session. If you want to get your teachers or anybody you know involved, doctors can watch as well. It doesn't matter if they're Scotland or if they're Wales, wherever they are. They can plug in, and we are going to do, because we're fed up waiting. We've been pushing for specialist teacher training for so long, we're going to do it. Continuity of learning must be provided for children, even if they're sick. And we know some are too sick to learn at all. So I'm coming to the end now. I would just say, I'm sure you've seen that. It's a quote the government have grabbed hold of. The foundation of every state is the education of its youth. Look when that was said. The 3rd century, you might say there's nothing new under the sun. I think there's one or two things I'd just like to say at the very end, which is that because education and health are so intertwined, you will find documents on the website there for doctors, by doctors, consultants, GPs, teachers, SENCOs. I first wrote that one for the Birmingham University School of Education. And there's new guidelines for educational psychologists as well who have to do assessments. Now, I understand now that you can diagnose quite early what virus children are suffering from with a rapid PCR test. I don't know much about this, and I hope we'll hear more from Byron, or I shall ask him afterwards otherwise, because we mustn't fail our children. We must find out what it is they're suffering from, because it may be possible, as Malcolm was saying, to actually treat this illness. As well as doing biomedical research, we can do something practical, and we can do it now. And I'm going to finish by letting the children speak for themselves, as I promised I would. I've got just 2 poems here. And to me, they are more eloquent than anything I could say myself. Here's one called When, by Lois E.J. Thorpe. I'll be back at school by September. 3 weeks at the end of term won't hurt. So I take the 3 weeks, only they turn into 3 months. September comes and goes. Now summer's dead. It's dark by 4 o'clock. Those 3 weeks of sun and stillness seem 3 years ago. I lie in bed, watching the trees turn from green to gold to gone, and Christmas is all but here. For weeks on end I've been indoors. I'm fed up with stale air. I spend the days lonely on my own. No one seems to care. My friends have all forgotten what it's like to see me in school. I have too. I've stopped making plans for when I'm well. When am I going to be better? And this one's called Please Don't, by Katie Jenkins. Please don't tell me I look just fine. Please don't say that I'll be right in no time, when I can hardly make it through the day. You don't have to live this life, so please don't tell me you know what it feels like, or how it really is to be this way. Please don't tell me I'm just a little tired. Don't shake your head and say I'm not really trying, when I want to spend some quiet time in bed. Come on, let's get you out the house. We all have our ups and downs. You haven't heard a single word I've said. Potions, pills, and wonder cures. I don't believe in miracles. I only wish you understood the truth, that to watch and wait and pray, live in hope from day to day, is all that either one of us can do. We must not fail our children. Thank you.